There we go.
Sono una bellissima di gol, veramente tutte e tre me le sono sparate. Wow! Viva? Dopo c'è presento quanto dovete durare un'ora? La sigaretta.
No, quando la sigaretta posso fare questa fumare.
Ma tu morire troppo da lì. Quando ce l'hai?
13 maggio.
Tu riesci a leggere tutto o schifo? Cioè...
Leggo tutto, non scritto nulla, però il problema è quello che dico qui. Diciamo che questa lettura estensiva serve per padroneggiare le tecniche di argomentazione. Questo per capire come realizzare la logica. Sono quello che serve la lettura estensiva. Perché poi ho visto le domande degli esami precedenti sono completamente distanti dagli articoli di controllo. Quindi l'articolo di connotazione garantisce una certa tecnica, una certa
Ho visto prima Roger Spinner, è venuto prima presentato,
molto bravo.
ma ho sentito che non avevo sentito parlare di questa presentazione sui privilege of speech invece della freedom of speech. Anche molto bello perché ha dato una grande profondità storica, la sua presentazione, veramente molto bella.
Siamo stati
Ti saluto.
a cena lunedì, 2 ore di tantissimo. Quindi ieri sono stata con un tempo perché mi è arrivato fino alle 2 del pomeriggio. Hai visto come è grande questi immagini quello che riesce a fare? Da una piccola cosa, si dà
Dove la panciotta che...
la mia distrutta quello lì.
Ma hai sempre invito ad andare a bere, ancora a bere e a mangiare? Sì, no,
non hai solo lezioni di così. Che se mi lascio con voi.
posso comprendere. Per ricerca o
vado a accompagnare
i ragazzi giovani. Molto entusiasta, esprime la voglia di
della giovane. Ti racconto le cose. Praticamente una cosa che tutti conoscono, quando vogliamo raccogliere, perché in consistenza nei riporti ci vuole percorrere. Siete d'accordo? Tutti e cinque ci siamo. La settimana scorsa era bellissimo, io 17 ci vuole fare. Ma tutti voi sapete, sono una degli esami.
Hanno senso queste competition?
Secondo
competition, streaming, thesis competition.
Life is an endless competition.
Te la ispiri proprio, no? Competition.
Competizione è prima di impazzire. No, ma secondo alcuni sono perfettamente così.
Tu da che parte stai? Cioè,
Io sono dalla parte, per me è un inizio perché quando fanno la vacanza obiettivi, quando io non voglio essere tutto tempo. E quindi per me insomma è una cosa utile, però per loro è una cosa, è una roba che da mettere nel curriculum.
devo vedere però un curriculum in certificare in base, no? Anche questa amica che adesso ha partecipato ai primi thesis competition, devi presentare la tua tesi in 3 minuti e poi c'è se sei successful, no? Successful, allora vai
Vinci lo sacchiotto.
è un volo per provincia e per andare a prendere lo sacchiotto in Australia. Se vinci anche lì, non lo so, ti danno qualcos'altro, una balena di peluche. Poi non so, contenti loro, dai. Anche l'altra volta c'era abbastanza gente, non così tanto però, mi sapete del 3 quella che avevo più gente. Questa è cosa che
No, c'è competition.
sì, non penso che sia una cosa così liscia, ma se no
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for attending the third lecture of this year's Qianmu Lecture in History and Culture of New Asia College. We have the honor of having Professor Peter Ball, Vice Provost for Advances in Learning, and Charles H. Carswell, Professor of East Asian Languages and Civilizations at Harvard University, to give us a talk today titled The Methodologies of Intellectual History. We are also very delighted to have Professor John Ladaway, Professor of Chinese Studies from the Center for China Studies of CUHK, to be the moderator of this lecture. So may I now pass over to Professor Ladaway to begin the lecture. Thank you.
just very quickly two things. The first is, we all know who Professor Peter Bull is, but I want to urge you to go out and read his books. Okay, so here we have, you might say, two bookends on a very distinguished career. This one in 1992, this one in 2008. I must say that I used both of these books in my critical cultural history of China. And this is, in particular, this is not the end of a career, but somebody looking back over 30 years of research and giving a synthetic survey and overview, which I think is absolutely brilliant. Just the fact that many of his chapters are entitled with just one word, including a very key word, belief. And if I may say so, the second thing I would like to say is just a personal reflection. Having been invited to present Peter today, it got me thinking about my own past and about destiny. Because I just, in fact, learned something particular about that destiny. What I knew to begin with is that I had started my studies of classical China at Leiden University, and Peter was there then. I've learned since that he was in his second year, I was in my first year. So I learned Mencius, I read Mencius with Will Idema, who later on went to Harvard. Then our paths diverged. I went to Harvard, I started there, he ended up there. And he then stayed at Leiden for a full 5 years, and then he did something else. He had something else in common with me, that is to say, a Taiwan interlude. But like his Dutch interlude, the Taiwan interlude was also much longer than mine. I stayed there for only 1 year, basically to learn to speak, not Putonghua, but Guoyu. And then later went back for quite a different reason. This is where destiny, our paths started to diverge. That is to say, in Taiwan, I took the opportunity to study Zhuangzi. And he spent 4 years there studying the Sishu Wujing. And there has been, therefore, a great deal of continuity in the course of his career, with that focus on the central Confucian tradition. But reflecting about destiny, I just discovered, I knew that he had a Japanese wife, but I didn't know that his Japanese wife had learned Dutch with my father's textbook. Because yes, while I was born and raised in America, I have a very good Dutch name called Lacheve, and it comes only from central, around the area of Utrecht. And my father was professor of Dutch at a place called Calvin College, and that explains how I ended up being at Leiden University. Okay, so we have these two paths which have diverged and converged, and then coming from very, very different directions, we've, I would say, met again in a very particular place. And that particular place is Chinese local society. Because Peter, coming from the study of Daoxue, of course, has constantly put emphasis on how much they are invested in local society as opposed to central government politics. And of course, my own path went from Zhuangzi, that is to say, from Daojia to Daojiao. And if you want to study Daojiao, well, then you have to go into the field, into the villages. So it is with great pleasure that I have this honor to introduce Peter 40 years later and to listen with you to his exploration of the question of methodology. Thank you.
In fact, John has had a far more distinguished career and a far more interesting one. I think if you begin by studying Zhuangzi, your life always becomes more interesting. But in honor of John and his memories of our beginning, I thought I would give the lecture in Dutch today. And this way, if you don't understand anything, you'll think it's because of the language and not because I actually don't know what I mean. So today's talk is about the methodologies of intellectual history. But before I do that, I gave a workshop yesterday where we had terrible bandwidth and all sorts of problems, and I forgot to introduce something. So this is for all the people who were at the workshop yesterday on technology. And what I wanted to show you was world map. So this is for for David for and his colleagues. But World Map has around 500,000 users at the moment. We created it at Harvard. It's free. It's open access. worldmap.harvard.edu. And you can use it to upload data, spatial data, to share it. You can share it with a particular working group or with everybody. In this case, I use it for a course, our online course called China X. If I were to just turn this off for a moment, let's see, and just show you how good this is, the quality of it. So it actually lends itself to really local work. Look at, right? So David, this is what you need, right? And in order for you to use this, you have to invite me back again to talk about to study local society with you. Okay, so I'm going to leave that behind and turn to my methodologies of local history issues. But I want to remind us where we began. Now, when I was asked to give these lectures 2 years ago, I was told there would be 3 lectures for 3 different publics. And the first public would be undergraduates. And for that, I talked about moral philosophy and social movement, Neo-Confucianism, and later imperial China. And what I did with that was try to show ways in which, taking the case of Lu Zutian in the 12th century as an example, we could deal with some of the aspects of social history, which is concerned with people and practices and groups of people and collecting lots of data and social networks, with intellectual history, which is very much focused on the individual, on texts, on rhetoric, on philosophies, on values, and so on. And so I thought that was a good idea for undergraduates to get the point across that perhaps we need to try to combine different aspects of historical disciplines together. The second lecture was to be a public lecture. That was on Sunday in the museum, the Hong Kong Museum. And for that I chose the title Paths Taken, Paths Avoided, Assessing the Role of Neo-Confucianism, Daoxue, in China's history. And what I argued there was against people who want to make this kind of argument, that Ruxue was the 中国社会的主流, and that 民族的复兴是跟Ruxue的复兴分不开的, that sort of argument, to say that in fact, Daoxue as a particular kind of Ruxue, Neo-Confucianism, Sumilixue as a kind of Ruxue, as a kind of Confucianism, involved making choices that we might not all agree with, and not necessarily the best choices, important choices, influential choices, but that they excluded things or diminished things or marginalized things that we might want to care about. So that argument was actually directed against the notion of Woxue as being an inherently good thing. I'm an anti-Woxue person, I should tell you. I don't study Neo-Confucianism because I think it's a good thing. I study Neo-Confucianism because it's an important thing. I don't study China because I think China is a wonderful place and I love China. I study China because it's an important place. It has consequences for the world. As an historian, we should study things that are consequential, that have importance, that have effects on the rest of us. So I want to make that clear, that my position here is not as an advocate of Confucianism, not as necessarily a critic of it, but as somebody who recognizes its importance in history. And in recognizing its importance in history, to recognize that it's not complete, that it excludes certain things I would like to include, for example. It's ahistorical in some sense as well. And that one of the challenges, and here I will be people very often ask me, what should China today do? And I said, what China today should do is what Chinese people should decide. It's not for me as a foreigner to say what China should do. But I will say one thing. It seems to me that the movement towards Woxue, which is so common now in the mainland, is something that is about exceptionalism. How we in China are exceptional, how our history is exceptional. And, you know, that's something that China has in common with America. America is filled with people who say America is exceptional. And our politicians all have to say America is exceptional, there's no other place like it. So, but that's one thing that China and America both have in common. We believe we're exceptional, right? But exceptionalism, a belief in being exceptional, needs to go hand in hand with a kind of universalism, with a belief that you're doing something, that you're exceptional in doing something that can be shared, that others can partake in, others can participate in. And that, of course, is one of the things that I would say about Daoxue. Daoxue emerges during a period when China is faced with foreign conquest, from the Liao, from the Jin, from the Yuan, from the Mongols. And yet Daoxue says to that, not that we are defending our culture, rather that we have a way of morality that everyone in the world can share, including those foreign conquerors. So, that actually has some bearing on what I want to talk about today. Talk about the methodology. So I talked about that, biographical database yesterday, China map, So my topic for today, methodologies of intellectual history. Now I should tell you, when I said I would do 3 lectures, the third lecture, I was told, was to be for graduate students and staff. And so this could be the boring lecture. And so if you get up and leave, I will not be offended. You can leave whenever you want. But it will not be, there are not a lot of pictures. It's all about intellectual issues, methodological issues. And methodological issues are actually the most boring issues of all. So, my apologies. I'm just doing what I was told, but you suckers came to the setting. So this is the methodologies of intellectual history. There are 2 sorts of general problems I want to address. One is the state of intellectual history. What intellectual history means is something I'll eventually get to, or try to address. And I want to address that in part because for a number of years now at Harvard, I've been teaching what's called a pro seminar in intellectual history in the history department with my colleague David Armitage, who's a historian of European and American intellectual history, and is a student of Quentin Skinner, one of the most influential figures in this field. And as we've been teaching this pro seminar for a number of years, a methodology seminar, I realized that what I thought intellectual history was, because I thought what I was doing was intellectual history, and what Professor Armitage thought it was different. And that in fact the European and American methodological writings on intellectual history were things that I felt left out, very important things for the study of China and China's intellectual traditions. So I guess I would say that I've come more and more to see that intellectual history is, on a methodological front, is limited in important ways. The second issue I want to take up is something that Professor Shun Huanggui, who invited me actually to give these lectures, and left and went back to Berkeley, good for him, but not for me necessarily, brought up in a fairly important article. He has been writing books on the history of Confucianism and Chinese thought. And he raises this, studying Confucian and comparative ethics, methodological questions. He raises the question of whether we can use methodological frameworks coming from Western history to study China's history, to study Chinese intellectual history and Chinese philosophy. Now, this question of whether analytic frameworks derived from European experience, and perhaps American experience, but mainly European experience, are valid and useful for the study of China is an interesting question, and it's coming to be asked more and more often. I've heard it being asked in Beijing, Shanghai, and here, in fact, at CUHK, Professor Shun brought it up himself. And the implication, I think, is that the reason why we use Western analytic frameworks, some people might say, I do not agree with this, but some people might say, is basically the result of imperialism. Right? There was a moment in time in the past when foreigners invaded China because China was rich and powerful, and that's the Jurchens and the Khitans and the Mongols invaded China for that reason. And they wanted the stuff, the goods in China. And China offered civilization. In the 19th and 20th century, the situation was reversed. People invaded China not to take from China, but to make China take from them. Right? To say, these are our ways of doing things, and you have to do them our way too. Right? And one could argue that academic disciplines, methodologies, are in fact a result of that imperialist past, and thus are fundamentally suspect as ways of studying the Chinese past. Now, I think that that's wrong. But I think there are grounds for making that argument, but I think it's wrong. And I want to make some distinctions. I want to make a distinction between disciplines and theories of historical progress or historical development, methodologies, and perspectives or questions. Now, when we talk about disciplines, what in fact do we mean? I think that there's no consensus about what a discipline is. But let's consider discipline as a body of knowledge, a set of questions that exist at any one moment, right? Certain ways of gathering evidence and analyzing it that are accepted by a community. And if we take that as generally as a discipline, we can see that to some extent, academic departments today represent disciplines. They also, of course, divide people. So a department of literature and a department of history, a department of philosophy are ways of dividing people, keeping them from talking to each other sometimes as well. But there are also disciplines in a sense that statistics is a discipline, right? That have methods, but don't necessarily have content. Let's take as a contrast, astronomy, we would agree, is a discipline. Astronomy today, of course, is not the same discipline as it was in the Han Dynasty or under the Greeks. But, in fact, both of them, in China and in the West, are cumulative disciplines that have bodies of knowledge, that have areas of concern, that have questions that change over time, that have ways of adducing evidence and analyzing it. And these are not unique. Some of the conclusions they reach are unique, some of their ways of understanding are different. But the fact is that we've had disciplines like that as well. History is another example. Geography is another example. So there are literature. There, in fact, are disciplines that exist in East and in West, right? That are cumulative, that are shared, that involve practices. But there are also disciplines that clearly, statistics being one, are not part of the early European tradition, the traditions of Mediterranean civilization, nor are they part of the traditions of Semitic civilization. One of the things that happens in the beginning, really, in the 18th century, is in the West, in a way that did not happen in the East, the development of theories of historical development, or the emergence of theories of historical development, theories of historical progress. And we find them from people like Herder, eventually Hegel, Marx. Some people would argue that these come out of Christianity. The Christians, of course, face the problem that what do they do with the ancient world, the world of Greeks and Romans, right? Versus the Christian present and future. So they basically have a tripartite past, present, future sort of notion of historical progress. But there start to appear theories of historical progress in, especially Germany, in Europe, that have tremendous influence. And what's interesting about those theories is they explicitly exclude Asia. They exclude India, they exclude China. even though people are aware that at least China has a certain historical mindedness, has historical texts, has tradition, and so on. The argument that you find people like Herder making, and that Hegel too, to some extent Marx, is there's no point in trying to include the experience of East Asia or Asia in our grand theory of world history, because those are countries that do not change. The Dutch term is the eeuwige stilstand, the eternal sort of still stagnation of these other cultures. And it's only in the West that we have progress. Only in the West that we have history. Because history involves change, and if a country doesn't change, it has no history. This turned out to be actually a very influential point of view. One of the reasons that at Harvard, people who do pre-modern Chinese and Japanese history are not in the history department is because they didn't belong there. Because China didn't have history until the West came. And it started to change. And so the view, which you can find actually articulated very clearly by none other than Fei Zhenting, John Fairbanks himself, right, is that China had a culture, and then it had progress when the West came, and it changed. And you have modern history, and you have something called the pre-modern. Well, that's one of the consequences of having theories of historical progress. And some would argue that methodologies, self-conscious methodologies of learning, only appear when we have theories of historical progress. That Marxist analysis, or Hegel's mode of historical analysis, right, are inherently tied to theories of progress. Right? And thus, to use them is to buy the theory. Now, one of my, China, as we know, is a communist country. Right? So, if its theory is wrong, if Marxist theory is wrong, then the whole foundation for the dictatorship of the Communist Party falls apart. Right? And I've had Chinese members of the Communist Party in China tell me that, well, the problem, historians, the problem with Marx is that it applied to Europe, but didn't apply to China. That Marxist historiography didn't apply to China. In fact, it doesn't apply to Europe either. Right? It doesn't work as an account of history. But let's take another discipline. Let's take statistics. So statistics is clearly a very modern discipline. Right? To what extent is it in fact connected to a theory of historical progress? Or is it simply the development of quantitative methodologies? And if we see it as quantitative methodologies that apply to anything, right, then would we want to say that China did not have quantitative methodologies? No, of course not. We know that China had quantitative methodologies. Math was not necessarily as important as literature, but there were always mathematicians. There were always astronomers. There were always people doing music. And all these things are quantitative studies. So I think that it's hard that, on one hand, I find myself saying, yes, certain methodologies are caught up, right, with theories of history, but other methodologies are not necessarily. And at the same time, I want to argue that we have disciplines that in fact exist both in the East and West and look just like each other. I want to make a further argument, which I think I touch on in one of the books that John showed, about comparability, commensurability. And I've stolen this, I think, from Roy Benoit. And the argument goes like this. Suppose you have a Kenyan and an American competing in the Boston Marathon. And every year, the Kenyan wins. And so we say, what is it about Kenyans that make them superior to Americans in the marathon? And we have all these analyses of Kenyans, they work harder, Americans are lazy, or they live at higher altitudes, Americans lower altitudes, and on and on. But in fact, that kind of analysis is fundamentally flawed. And it's flawed because the Kenyan and the American in the marathon, who win number 1, number 2, are more like each other than they are like everybody else in the world. Right? And I want you to extend that to whole countries. Complex, enduring societies and civilizations are more like each other than anywhere else in the world. And in that sense, Mediterranean civilization and Semitic civilization actually are really much more like each other than they are to all the tribes of Papua New Guinea, 200 different civilizations that you can find there. Now, it is true, however, to talk about methodologies. That today we see a recurrence of methodologies which are tied to theories of history. It's not as if this just appeared in the 19th and early 20th century, right? With, let's say, Weberianism, which clearly is tied to theories of rationality and historical progress. The attack on Weberian functionalism and structuralism, the post-structuralist and postmodernist move that is often associated with Foucault, Derrida, clearly in the case of Foucault, is very much involved with the theory of Western history and Western modernity. And so the adoption of Foucauldian rhetoric and discourse, right, and its application to China's history is in fact hard to disentangle from the theories that lie behind it regarding the West. Now, I think I'm probably a little bit of a deconstructionist, but I'm not a postmodernist. And it seems to me there's lots of stuff that we can take methodologically out of deconstruction, simply to be good readers of poetry, for example, without having to see ourselves as postmodernists. I'll tell you a story. Once I had a friend who did Korean history. She's now since passed away. And she did work that was on ritual, Korean court ritual. I don't know if you know a lot about Korean court ritual, but it's very boring. It's extremely boring. At least my view is that, or maybe it was the way she did it that was boring, I'm not sure. And one year, I was at a conference, and she gave a conference paper, and the first 20 pages were all about postmodern theory. Nothing about Korean, just 20 pages sort of reciting the whole picture of postmodern theory. Tremendously useful if you wanted to learn about postmodern theory methodology. And then she had 20 pages all about court ritual in Korea. It was the same old court ritual in Korea that she wrote about before. And I said to her, well, you know, why did you include the first 20 pages since it didn't have any influence on the last 20 pages? And she said, well, she said, you know, it took me so long to learn it, I had to show that I could talk that. I think a lot of the methodologies we do are like that. But some of the methodologies actually have really, really serious implications. I think I want to argue that we need to consider them very seriously in thinking about China. And if we can approach it self-consciously, with a sense of where it comes from, why it's coming from somewhere, and ask ourselves, does this have any bearing on what we're looking at in the Chinese context? And contextualize things wisely, I don't think there's a real problem. The last distinction I want to make is perspectives. There are people, I'm often asked the question, well, how would you describe the difference between Chinese scholarship and American scholarship, or Western scholarship? And I cannot answer that question. I do not think there is any reasonable answer to that question, right? It's too general, it's too essentialist. The fact of the matter is that somebody who does Chinese intellectual history, the history of Chinese philosophy, like Professor Liu, or somebody who does the history, or looks at Chinese literature, like Professor Liu Fan, both of whom I've had as colleagues, or Taoism, or local history, like Professor Ford, Professor Locke. They have much more in common with each other across cultures, people who study literature or philosophy or intellectual history of local society, than they do with different people in their own fields. A social economic historian in the West has much more in common with a social economic historian in China than they do with somebody who does the history of philosophy in the West or in China. Right? So we come back to the fact that we actually operate within disciplines. And if we operate within disciplines, then it is true that we have different questions. That somebody who grows up in a particular language, in a particular culture, with a particular government, with a particular set of experiences, talking to a particular set of people, is more likely to ask certain kinds of questions, or to find certain kinds of questions important and meaningful than somebody else who had a different set of experiences. So that's a matter of perspective, but it's not the same thing as methodology. It's a matter of what kinds of questions you decide are important for your audience and for yourself. Now, I was going to talk about a personal perspective, but I'm wasting so much time. I'm supposed to, how long do I have to go to? Till 6, so I can talk to people for 2 hours straight, right? One of the things I've learned is after every 20 minutes you have to tell a joke to see if people are awake still. So that was the joke, just ask if they were awake still. I'll say something personal about this. When I was an undergraduate in Leiden, and we had a very traditional education, the whole time I was an undergraduate, I never had to write a single paper. They didn't ask us to write papers. They said, well, you went to high school. Except I went to American high school, not Dutch high school. A world of difference. And you learned how to write papers, so you already know how to do that. So don't worry about that. We never had a seminar where we asked questions about a text. Classes we had were based on reading and translating. Right? In fact, the class I had in Japanese grammar, the professor read his notes and we had to copy it down word for word. I said to him, do you know that Xerox machines have just been invented, copying machines, we can copy your notes. And he said, no, that would not do. Right? We had to copy them down by hand. The education was such, we never had written examinations. All our examinations were oral. So you go and see the professor and say, I'm ready to be examined in Guang Guanzhi. You have 50 pieces of Guang Guanzhi you have to have read. And you go in, the professor says, sit down, turn to page 36, column 3, start to translate, and explain every term and explain all the grammar. Right? And that was the examination. So I passed all the examinations, and you were done. And it wasn't until I went to America that I realized that you actually could have a class where you ask questions about interesting things. Because when I was a student in Taiwan, and was studying the Sishu Wujing, you did not ask the professor questions about ideas. You asked the professor to, please, 老师, 多给我介绍一下当时意见这样子, and that sort of thing. So, but I went with the idea that I was sort of going to do institutional history, and the work that I was looking at was the Song Dynasty. I knew I wanted to work in the middle period, so much was changing, it was so interesting. And it was Edwin Crackey's civil service in South China. And so what Crackey did was try to understand changes in the way officials were chosen. And what he wanted to show was that there was increasing rationality. And that was sort of driving things forward, the rationality of history. And so it was in fact, this is when I say something that's wrong. The rationality of history was driving forward these changes. And he would look at that and he would say, well, I've done my work, I showed that. So he's coming out of Max Weber, but he's also refuting Max Weber, because Max Weber didn't think that the Chinese bureaucracy was driven by rationality. But in fact, he didn't explain why things changed the way they changed. He didn't explain why politicians decided to adopt new institutions. It was enough for him to sort of describe the course of history as increasing rationality. Now, at the same time, I started studying the Sishu Wujing with an old gentleman. He died a couple of years ago at 107. Many students in Taiwan. And those of you, is anyone here from Taiwan? Right? No? Okay. So if there's no one here from Taiwan, you wouldn't necessarily know. There's no known as Yulao, Yulao. But so we had many students, most of the Chinese students, some foreign students like me. And what I saw with him was that for him, the classics, the Chinese classics, were actually the material with which he thought. Right? He didn't think in terms of Western political theory and things like this. Well, he was sort of a Gongyang, Jinwen Xuepai sort of guy. But when he looked at the world, and he read the newspaper, and he loved to talk about politics, but he saw it through the lens of Confucian classical hermeneutics. And it was real to him. And it occurred to me at that moment that if we are trying to account for why people make the choices they make, why they do the things they do, we actually need to understand how they see the world. What is the lens through which they see the world? What are the values that they hold and which they look at and say, oh, that's a problem, that's important, that's not important, this is something we should do. So that was what I was seeing with Yulao, right? Was that here was a man who saw the world through a certain lens, and if it was true for him, it must have been true for people in the past as well. Particularly since he was such an oddity in Taiwan at that moment. He's also one of these guys who only wore Chinese clothes. I think he was the last person in Taiwan except the poorest farmer who only wore Chinese clothes. And so I remember writing home to my professor and saying, I think I'm going to switch my subject because I'm spending my time, I'm not going to finish my degree right away, I'm going to spend my time reading the Sichuan routine. And my professor wrote back and said, huh? Why are you doing that? That's all sort of Wuxue, that's all the past, that's historical subject, irrelevant. And I said, I don't know. I said, if you were Chinese and you didn't know much about European history and you wanted to go study medieval Europe, wouldn't you tell the Chinese student that they ought to read the Bible and know what Catholicism was about and know the value structures that people were being taught at the time? And I said, that's all I'm doing. I'm doing the equivalent. And he said, in that case, it's okay. But it seemed to me that the problem then might be described as the problem of mediation. In other words, what are the things that people use through which to see the world? How do they cultivate a way of understanding? Now, we go to college. I teach in a college, right? We teach you history, we teach you physics, we teach you chemistry, we teach you literature. And we say that you should acquire all this stuff. And this stuff becomes part of you if we teach it successfully. And as you go on in life and you see the world, you can see it, you see the world through the lens that's shaped. In a sense, it's mediated by all that you've learned. And so if I'm going to be interested in studying mediation in China, right? That interface between the world as it really is, objective conditions, and what people actually see, and what they value and choose to do, what do I study? So, one option would be to study philosophy. But I wasn't very good at philosophy. In fact, I was pretty bad at philosophy, and it was too abstract. And I wasn't always sure that in the Chinese tradition that philosophy was always important. It wasn't necessarily always important. Then I said, maybe literature. I said, no, literature, first of all, I don't know. I don't read poetry. I don't understand literature. Too hard to do. So literature won't work. Although I think I've changed my view today. And I couldn't see how literature really provided that sort of mediation, given the way it was being taught in the circles that I moved in. I actually think today that literature is probably one of the more important things to study, and if we study the Chinese past. And so I hit on that. I knew there was this subject called values, right? The sort of jiazhi that people have, the shijie guan, the way in which they saw the world. And that's sort of what I wanted to study. And eventually I found out you could call that intellectual history. And at first, I wanted to do that through looking at what are called mentalité, shared ideas among masses of people. So Professor Ford asked me the other day when I was talking about Daoxue, about Neo-Confucianism, he said, why are we talking about Sangang Wuchang? Now, you know I didn't answer that question, right? But I guess part of the answer to that, about why I didn't know about Sangang Wuchang, is because I shifted away from mentalities and thinking about mentalities, really to thinking about arguments. Who made arguments and try to persuade others? And so my real answer to Professor 4 is why I don't care about Sangang Wuchang, even if lots of people did, is that I was concerned that people who made arguments about why Sangang Wuchang ought to matter versus people who thought something else should matter. So I began to see what I was doing as really tracing the history of argument, making arguments in the Chinese tradition. And clearly, if you're working in middle period history from, let's say, the 8th century on into the 14th century, 15th century, into the 15th century for sure, then the big question, the big issue for people who make arguments, if you're thinking about arguments people make, right? The big issue is Daoxia, the Confucius. How do we account for the rise of a new definition of Confucianism? How do we explain how that was possible? I'm not going to go into all the different kinds of explanations and why I think some of them are better than others, but just to say that was the big problem, right? That I started to get at, and the field I decided that I wanted to identify with was Daoxia. Sorry, not Daoxia, was intellectual history. Yes, so studying arguments of mentalities, I got ahead of myself. So, Leonard Krieger, in this article, professor at the University of Chicago, and so I'm going to start to talk now, this is the really boring part, okay, about some methodological writings in intellectual history. Not all of them by any means, not all the ones that we cover in our course by any means, but he says, he talks about this in the Autonomy of Intellectual History, he says, you know, if you want to agree upon a method, you first have to agree upon the object. So if you know what the object of study is, then you can agree upon the method. He said, but in intellectual history, we don't have a consensus about the object of study, and so we cannot have a consensus about the method. And I agree with that. I don't think we have an agreed upon object of study, and I don't think we have an agreed upon method. Now, there are lots of methods out there, and some of them that I'm not going to be engaged in, but I think are worthwhile thinking about, really is something that's been called now the international term in intellectual history. And my colleague David Armitage is very much a proponent of this. Now, the people who are proponents of it are by and large talking about the spread of Western ideas. Right? They're talking about how Western ideas traveled from the West to the East, to India, to East Asia, to Japan, and so on, and what happens then. What makes this different from an earlier generation of people writing about the spread of Western ideas and ideologies is that this new generation of scholars recognizes that the meaning of these ideas changes when it gets into a new context. So that democracy in India means something different from democracy in Holland or in the United States, certainly different from what it means in the United States. In fact, what democracy means in Holland is very different from the United States, I think. Whereas we know in the United States it means having money to buy political power, more or less. But this turn in international history, I think, is interesting. The contrast might be, there's a book that the French historian Jacques Genet wrote a number of years ago on, I think it was called China and the Christian Impact. And what Genet argued was that the Chinese could simply not understand Christianity. This is, he's writing about the late Ming, Matteo Ricci, 16th century into the 17th century. The Chinese that could not understand Christianity, they did not have the vocabulary, the conceptual vocabulary necessary to it. And at one level, that's very attractive, and you say, well, you know, the ultimate implication of that is, unless we all speak the same language and conceive of things the same way, none of us can understand each other, and yet we think we can understand each other very often. Maybe we can't at all. But what Genet did not do, and what these new international historians, intellectual historians do is say, but of course Christianity is going to mean something different in a Chinese context. And if we ask why people like Xu Guangqi became Christians, we then begin to understand what it is they thought about Christianity, what it meant. And that's what I think this new international intellectual history is doing. That's different from what happened before. You know, if you think about the most popular Western food in China, right, which is kandaiji, right? And you all know what it is. But it means something very different in China than it means in the United States, right? There's that meaningfulness that we should be concerned with, and not only the process of creating deep fried chicken. I do think that we have not done enough to think about how, for example, when ideas from Tang and Song travel abroad, or even travel over time, how they change. Right? We know that Neo-Confucianism goes into Korea, it goes to Vietnam, it goes to Japan eventually, but we've not really sat down and tried to figure out how those countries transform those teachings. We've tried to always assume that somehow the teachings are constant and are understood in the same way over time and over space. There's also the possibility, and this is very difficult to do, I think, of comparative intellectual history. Have any of you looked at Jeffrey Lloyd's Adversaries and Authorities, Investigation of Ancient Chinese and Greek Science, Ancient Greek and Chinese Science? It's very interesting because he sets out to do a comparison of Greek science with Han Dynasty science. And he is very serious about it in a way that is, he knows his Greek stuff and he really spends time learning the Chinese stuff, even though he doesn't read Chinese. And I think we've had no one coming out of Chinese studies who has done the same thing going the other direction. And Lloyd's argument is in this essence that in Greece, because they have many schools competing with each other, there is a particular way in which debate is seen as essential to the search for truth. And in China, there is a concern with unity and making everything fit together in service of the empire. Right? And the reason he makes this choice is not to denigrate China, although you start to think, so the Chinese all think alike, and the West have individuality, the Chinese don't have individuality. This sounds like some pretty typical old prejudices to me. But the reason he's doing that argument is he wants to tell people who do Western history of science that the progress of the history of science is due to social factors and institutional situations and not due to the discovery of truth. So actually he's using China to attack Western history of science, right? But we might say, you know, Jeffrey, if you had looked at the Warring States period instead, you might have reached very different conclusions about the so-called Chinese way of learning about the natural world. Anyways, Maurice Landaubat has a suggestion in his critique of the history of ideas and intellectual history. He's trying to defend the history of philosophy. And along the way, he makes what I think is an extremely useful argument for all of us. That he says, you know, and here is the case where this is a methodological point that I don't think is made in the Chinese literature, but which I think we could see immediately. He says, the history of philosophy is a special history. It's different from social time. And that's true of the history of science, it's true of the history of literature, the history of art, the history of medicine. These are histories that are created retrospectively. Okay? So a philosopher looks back and says, aha, I'm going to teach you the history of philosophy, and these are the things I'm going to pick out from the past in order to give you an account, right, of how philosophy developed. That's a retrospective view, and it's a special history. Now, the value of this is the contrast to what we might call general history. And I want to sort of include intellectual history within the field of general history to some extent. General history is social time. Social time is continuous. It never stops. A special history chooses discrete moments in time and puts them together to tell a story. But social time is non-stop and continuous. We're all part of social time. I think that Mondelbaum's point here is useful, though, because if we think about how do we do intellectual history, what we're really doing is looking at different special histories that are being enacted at a certain moment. And if we think back to the 11th century, when the first moral philosophers, Joduni, Januzaj, Arkham, appeared, right? They, in fact, were creating a new field, right, that coexisted with things that we might very well call special histories. Literature had its own special history. It defined, for example, Han Yu and Du Fu as the great masters of prose and poetry. This movement towards special history helps us, I think of what intellectual culture is. Intellectual culture, the world in which intellectuals operate and argue, is composed of different histories, of different sets of practices, which are recognizable, which are discrete, which have their own standards and their own special histories. Now, one of the things that I should try to catch up and see where I am with my pages, because I do have a long paper written, but I'm not reading it, unfortunately, so I get lost. Arthur Lovejoy has, in the 1930s, created the notion of the history of ideas as a very technical term. It's expanded since then, but Lovejoy's kind of argument went, when he made it, he did not mean Guanyin. Some people have understood history of ideas to be history of Guanyin, history of concepts. That wasn't what Lovejoy meant. Lovejoy thought that there were basic ideas, unit ideas, that transcended time and space, could move into different fields, different special histories, different languages, but these ideas were always constant. And those ideas had to be put together in new ways at different points. Right? He was interested in the ideas that were the building blocks of thought, the building blocks of ideology. And they were ideas that you could, in fact, describe in universalistic terms. The idea, for example, of gradation. Gradation simply means ranking things according to some perceived value. So, but Lovejoy never really had a following in China, although, in fact, the dictionary of the history of ideas is translated as Guanyin Shidao, right? Does exist in Chinese, and his later followers had a much broader view, were less limited to his methodologies now. And in fact, we think about this broader view of history of ideas, of trying to define ideas and concepts, then of course this is a good Chinese tradition as well. In the Neo-Confucian case, it begins in the 12th, early 13th century, when Chen Zhui does the Beixi Zi, or as Chen Zhui translated it, Chan Wen-Xin translated it, Neo-Confucian terms explained. It's a glossary of major terminologies. Now, there is, and this is sort of going to be central to what I want to say today, and I will hurry up and say it more quickly now, is that there's a tension between people who talk about ideas and people who talk about language. Lovejoy is on the extreme end of people who talk about ideas and argue that these ideas can be defined and transcend language. They're not bound to language, any time, any place that they can move around. And that's why he calls them unit ideas. The development of ideas in a more general sense, right, does seem to be much more caught up in language. And here we have something like Dominic Lecopner's argument, which is one we recognize very well, and that is that when we read texts, we read important texts, great books, for example, and we should have a dialogic relationship with these texts. We should think about the author, we should think about the times of the author, right? But just like Mitch just said, right? When you read the words of the person, you think about the person, right? That's what Lecompre wants to do too, but much more self-consciously perhaps, and much more methodologically. But he wants to defend the idea that when we read books, we shouldn't be reading to try to put people in historical context and do institutional history. We should be reading for ourselves. We should be historically aware in reading. We want to understand what the person meant. But ultimately, we read intellectual texts because we want to think. And that strikes me as being, of course, exactly what we do in college. In college courses on great books is, in fact, giving students a chance to think and to read. There's also this notion of the spirit of the times. The spirit of the times, I think, has really fallen away as a methodology of intellectual history. It has fallen away in part, I think, because we've come to recognize, as Baumer himself already in 1949 was beginning to recognize, that when we try to generalize about the spirit of the times, very often what we're doing is projecting our own ideas back onto the past, making things people agree with each other who did not agree. And yet, people have gone on, and Charles Moore's book is an example of this, to try to define the Chinese mind. Now, maybe there is a Chinese mind. There is clearly not a Chinese mind. But you notice what he says, the essentials of philosophy and culture. The essentials of philosophy and culture. So he has to go out and define with his colleagues what those essentials are. Right? And you then have to decide whether you agree with them or not. But I think we can always find things we don't agree with. It's still as popular, I think, in China to talk about Song learning. And, you know, I have to say, if we were to look at the 11th century and say, what are the things that 11th century thinkers care about? One of the things they care about is being systematic, universal, and coherent. So we do see commonalities. There are trends, after all, and we do need to be aware of it. Okay. But the big thing that's happened in intellectual history actually has been a movement away from ideas and a movement towards language. And this has been called the linguistic turn. And it's been since the 1980s, it's been the subject of a great deal of debate. Now in America, we like to turn every which way. We have cultural turns, spatial turns, economic turns, international turns, but the linguistic turn has to rank up there as being really, really significant. Precisely because it was an alternative to ideas as a way of talking about intellectual history. Quentin Skinner, in 1969, writes this extraordinarily profound book. And he has two targets. The first target is the idea that social factors determine the text, that if we want to understand intellectual change, it's all due to social factors. You know, the rich get, because there are basically a Marxist point of view, right? Who controls the means of production, that leads to certain kinds of ideologies, and so on. But I think intellectual history is long since left that. What's more interesting is that he attacks the notion that we can talk about doctrines and we can talk about coherence. So Skinner's argument is that, in fact, when we think a thinker has a doctrine, we're imputing the doctrine to the thinker. And when we see a thinker or a book as being coherent, internally coherent, we're reading that coherence into the work. What we have instead, he argues, is language. And this is the first quote. To write the history of an idea, it may be said, is obviously, to write, in effect, the history of a sentence. And another quote, the only history to be written is thus a history of the various statements made in a given expression. He's serious, right? To write the history of an idea, it may be said, and then another quote, and it follows from this, that the appropriate methodology for the history of ideas must be concerned, first of all, to delineate the whole range of communications which could have been conventionally performed on the given occasion by the utterance of the given utterance, and next to trace the relations between the given utterance and its wider linguistic context as a means of decoding the actual intention of the given writer. Clear? Not entirely clear, perhaps. My wife is looking at me saying, what? What he's saying, I think, is intellectual history works only as a discussion of language, not of ideas. We're talking about language. Now, he's influenced by some of the language philosophers. By the way, Quentin Skinner gives rise to a school called the Cambridge School. It's still probably the single most influential movement in English language intellectual history. The Germans do their own thing, the French do their own thing, but Skinner, certainly in the English-speaking world, has still reigned supreme, I'm afraid. But there's validity to what he says, right? That we actually, if we want to talk about concepts, can we really take them apart from the cultural context in which they're written? And he makes the point, following Austin, the language philosopher, that when we read a text, we need to understand two things. The first is we need to know what it says, right? If you're reading an assumed text, you need to read the text. You need to understand the words. But then the second question is, what was the writer trying to accomplish by writing? What was the speaker trying to accomplish by speaking? Right? That's a different issue. And the most obvious case is satire. Right? A satirist means exactly the opposite of what he may be saying. Right? So that notion of what is the person trying to accomplish gets us to intentionality. But to understand what a person is trying to accomplish, we need to understand what those words mean in that context in which the person is writing and speaking. That's the givenness of things, right? The utterance, the words, the language that is used has meaning relative to the language that people at that time are speaking and talking about. And this applies perfectly well to Daoxuan. And to Song thought generally, to Neo-Confucian thought in particular, because it is a shared discourse that's ongoing, that's evolving. Right? And we can see that what somebody says is significant precisely because of the kinds of other utterances that people have at the time. So I think that that's an example of methodology, right? That undoes the notion of ideas to some extent, but clearly transcends cultures and works perfectly well from my perspective in a Chinese context as well. And in fact, we can find this sort of thing. Some of you will have read Zhu Xi's Xu to the Zhongyong Jiangju, his commentary on the Zhongyong, the Doctrine of the Name. Zhu Xi argues in that text that the entire Ru tradition, the Daoxuan tradition, right, goes back to one sentence uttered by Yao Tzu, hold fast to the meaning. And that everything since has been an elaboration on that one sentence. Right? Now that is a language theory of intellectual history. Right? That's really quite extraordinary to think that he really is saying that it's the language that does it. And this, of course, brings me to something that I mentioned this the other day, talking to Due Ming, my former colleague. And I asked him whether he thought that Confucianism could be transmitted or Confucianism could exist if the people who were Confucian scholars could not read the Sishu Wu Jing in Chinese. Right? Buddhism translates, Christianity translates, why not Confucianism or Confucian text? And his answer was no. No, you actually have to be able to read the text in the original to be a Confucian, which I thought was actually very interesting and probably valid as well. I think my time is about up, but I have a couple more things to say. And that's sort of to bring intellectual history back into history. One of the problems with Skinner, with Le Coffre, with Lovejoy, is if we ask the question, how do you explain why Dao Xue became so successful? How do you explain why arguments made for Dao Xue were so persuasive? Right? They have no answer. They have no methodology by which that question could be answered. And in fact, that question of how do we account for historical change disappears entirely from the methodology of intellectual history today. And that, it seems to me, is a cause for concern. There are things that I think are of importance and of value. I think Reinhard Koselleck's notion of conceptual history, which really is Guanyin history, right? That conceptual history is a way of talking about it. That what Koselleck, a German intellectual historian, argues is that what we need to look at is the terminologies that are used to express ideas, some of which are new, some of which are old, some of which are transformed, and to see how those start to construct society. That's not trying to figure out how society determines thought, but how the language of thought helps influence and create social change. And in doing that, he makes the point that there's certain periods in history, he's concerned with German modernity above all, where lots of ideas are being put together. Lots of ideas are being put together, and those are moments he calls it the saddle period, big hump, right? All of a sudden, the language is changing, new ideas are coming up. Well, we can recognize that right away in the 11th and 12th century. Neo-Confucianism represents a new vocabulary, a new set of concepts, and we can see how that extends out and helps construct society. The other person that I think is actually offers something very valuable to say is the French historian. Notice that I'm moving to the continent, away from England. The French historian, oh, I did something. Thank you. Just keep going. We'll get there eventually. The French historian Roger Chartier. And Chartier says in this article, yeah, I think it's the second to last slide. Thank you so much. Chartier says in this article, he says, you know, maybe the time has come not to talk about intellectual history, but to talk about socio-cultural history. And I think that's right. And socio-cultural history is, in fact, an attempt to bring together the study of society and elites and social movements with ideas, with the language of ideas, with the concepts and the language of concepts, as I call it. There is something that I would like to suggest. It seems to me that in China, in the study of Chinese intellectual history, there's very often a tendency to talk about the Zhongguoren, the Chinese. The Chinese people think like that. We have no idea what people thought. We have some texts with a very limited set of people who make arguments about certain things, and we can at least say what they're arguing about to each other. But I think the time has really come that rather than trying to talk about how the Chinese people thought, or Chinese values, or Chinese ways of thinking, that we actually should be quite specific about who we're talking about. And who we're talking about the Tang. We're really talking about these great families, the Shizhu, who in the 11th in northern Song are transformed or reconstituted in some way as Shidafu. And by the 12th century, right, are a much larger group of the people who are the local elites, the educated local elites, participants in the examination system, the Shiren, right? Different from the Min, different from the Guanzhi, the people who are officials, or the officials are chosen from among that group. And it would be a good thing for us to keep in mind who we're talking about and what they care about. Well, what do they care about? Well, one way to think about what they care about is that they're trying to figure out how do we combine moral action, cultural knowledge, and politics. And in thinking about their arguments, what we might better do is, in fact, to use their conceptual vocabulary. I know I have to finish, and this is just more frequent this happens. Use their conceptual vocabulary to try to get back and ask, how did they put the world together? and what were the different ways in which they did. And since I've written about that, I won't try to tell you about it here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, for this extremely stimulating tour d'horizon, I'm afraid is what we'll have to call this. We've really gone from east to west, from Europe. We've crossed several, two oceans at least, not the Indian Ocean. It's more in the news these days, but now is the opportunity for people to pose questions.
So, almost no one stopped. That's because of the microphone. So if you do have questions, feel free to ask. If you don't have questions, then this is my last lecture and I can go home.
Well, while I'm waiting for you all to wake up and ask your questions, I'm going to take the same privilege David took the other day and ask a couple of questions. Some of the things you said today and many of the things that you've written make me ask you two questions which are related. The first is you continue to use the translation classics to refer to the Jing, but are they in fact not functioning more like scriptures? What you just said, well, if you want to know about medieval Europe, what do you think you should start doing? Well, you should start reading the Bible. And it's clear that the Jing and the Sishu then, and the change precisely in the scriptural canon is perhaps the most significant thing we can say about Dao Xue. So that's the first question. The related question is the word, of course, for the center of cognition, or whatever you want to call it, in China is Xin. And people translate it mind and heart. And I wonder why we don't just translate it heart. Why is this a question that's important, it seems to me? Well, because if we look at China from Greece, as you just told us Jeffrey Lloyd did, of course he did a book together with Sivan on precisely this subject as well. If we look at China from the point of view of Greece, I think that it is very, very difficult to communicate. And on that regard, Jianmei was right, because he was looking at China from the point of view of a Greek tradition, Greek philosophical tradition. However, if you look at it from the point of view of the biblical Hebrew tradition, well, then you notice immediately that the heart of the biblical person is also the heart. So I wonder whether, first of all, you could talk a little bit about that, and then my ultimate question really is, for there to be real communication between China and the West, do we not have to start from their respective religious traditions, which clearly, in your view, also includes the Confucian tradition?
So I think I call the Jing the classics because that's how I've always called it. And I'm a person of habit. But now that you bring this up, would I easily want to use the translation scripture? The 5 scriptures of Wu Jing. And I think not. I'll tell you why not. I recognize that the boundaries and the divisions and the distinctions are not the same as in the West. Just like, color, people made the point that the color spectrum gets divided up in different cultures differently. I think there are things that are divided up somewhat differently. But it seems to me that in the Christian tradition of the Bible, which is a little bit different from the Talmudic tradition, that the Bible has a kind of authority that does not allow for commentary. And in China, commentary is from the Han Dynasty on, always part of reading. So that to read really well and think about it almost invites you to start to write your own commentary. So that makes me a little bit uneasy because I think commentaries go in many ways, and not everybody is going to accept that there's any kind of inerrancy. Of course, not everyone in the Christian tradition accepts that either in talking about the Bible. So I can see ways in which for some people it's scripture, but I can see ways in which for a lot of people it's not. And I think there are Shin as the mind and heart. So I was in last week. I was in Tokyo and going through a temple somewhere. Oh no, that was Hibiya Koen, the Hibiya Goguin, right? And they have a pond in the shape of a crocodile, like the heart, the shins, right? Character shins. And I think about going into local society. I think in Dongyang, in the hills of Dongyang, into Sintang, and they still have a big red heart drawn on the wall. A red heart showing, in Western style heart, right? Not the character, showing loyalty to Chairman Mao. So clearly the heart does a lot of service in lots of places. So what is human nature? Human nature is the lead species of a ship, right? And that ship is a cognitive ship. If you then turn to somebody and say, well, if their notion of Shin is so caught up with intuition, right? And think of Ryan Ming with the notion of Itiandi Wamu Wei Iti. And your Liang Shin is sort of imbued with that consciousness and spontaneously can tell what is right and wrong in your own intentionality that rises within you. And you were to say that that's not such a cognitive thing as an intuitive thing. I have no problem with that, which is why it's sometimes called heart and mind. So I've dodged his effort to make me grant that Confucianism is religious. Although there was a talk about this Neo-Confucianism in history book when it first came out at Harvard. It turned out to be a lot of people were interested in it. So it's a big audience, and Mike Sony was one of the commentators, and Mike says, after reading this book, everyone will have to agree that Confucianism is a religion. And there were some Confucians in the audience who said, no, we don't. Right? And they got very upset. Well, I've done my best. There we go.
Hello, Professor Wu. I wanted to ask you about the modern significance of Confucianism in the world, because now China is supposed maybe the new rising power in the international politics, and then how nowadays, not in 10 years ago in the world, not so many Confucius academics, 孔子学员, and then now so many 孔子学员. Promoted by Communist Party of China. I'm a Hong Kong guy. I'm so curious why Communist Party can promote Confucianism. So I'm curious to interact with you. Thank you.
So the Kunzi Shuiyuan, yes, the Hanban. So unfortunately, Harvard does not have one. I would take their money right away. As far as I can tell, in America, the you teach Chinese language, and that's pretty much. And then they maybe do some cultural displays, Chinese cooking, cultural things. I think that's fine. I mean, the British have something called the British Council, which is somewhat more intellectual, but also offers English classes. So I didn't do anything. So that seems to me fine. The modern significance of Confucianism. How many of you believe that Confucianism has modern significance? Thank you. Very few of you. I'm appalled. I think it actually has. You want me to hold this? Is that okay? I think it actually does have modern significance. When I started to study China in the 1960s, Confucianism was an historical topic. It was dead, gone, and over. And as the late Fred Waitman once said, as Lazarus from the dead, it keeps coming back. And I do think it keeps coming back, and in many guises. And one of the traditional tensions of Confucianism is that people with political power see it as a useful device and want to use it, and serious Confucians want to oppose political power, which is just as it should be. Because if anything, Confucianism has to provide two things at once. It has to provide a justification for political, social, and economic orders, and it has to provide the grounds for critiquing those orders. I think it's important to keep in mind that Confucianism does not reject the reality of the family. Remember Mencius versus Yang and Wu. It does not reject the reality of the family. It does not reject the reality of the state. It does not reject the division of labor. It does not reject the value of language and learning from the past. But it says, how do we do these things? Those matters are in debate. And if you say, does Confucianism have international world significance today? I think that anything that can say, A, we need to find a way to justify the existence of the economy, society, government, and intellectual life, and at the same time have grounds for critiquing it, is a good thing. I'm all in favor of that. So if that's what the international aspect of Confucianism is, good. But then we have to make the arguments about what is the proper economic order? Right? How much inequality is acceptable? What role does the family have? Right? These are all things that have to be debated. But I don't think there's one Confucian view on all those matters. That's my view.
People don't always practice what they thought, so there are huge gaps between that. So have you noticed that some difference of song intellectuals did and thought?
Oh, sure. What is that phrase? What is chung? Chung is when your yen really can be chunged, can be realized in action. By the way, 如果人家提问题用普通话、国语也可以用，随便，我听不懂，不会讲是听不懂。And I think that this issue of the relationship between yen and xing, words and behavior, and later between zhi and xing, between knowledge and behavior, is always an issue. Always an issue. And one of the general things I would say is that particularly once Gaoxue enters the examination system, the Kenzhu, and the Sishu become required reading and study for the examinations, and the first part of the examinations, which you must pass, right, which decides passing or failing, is the essays, the Bahu essays on the Sishu, right? Once that is established, then anyone who wants to pass the examination has to learn how to talk the talk. And we all know we can learn how to talk the talk. Some of us can do it very cleverly. It doesn't mean we believe it. So I grant right away that speaking is not believing. But what's interesting is that sometimes people want to believe what they speak. And not only that, they try to act accordingly. And so I think it's very hard to account for some of the social movements that take place in this Soviet Yuan and Ming without seeing that as people who are seriously trying to put into practice what they speak. Is that an answer? Did that answer? Okay. I'll go around.
I was struck by your sentence that we operate within disciplines. I would like to hear your opinion about the so-called interdisciplinary term within academia itself. And what's your view on that? Because I came from a program that called itself like a China study, and we try to treat China as the subject, but I'm not very sure how we go around about it. Thank you.
Oh, that's a good question. That's also a good question. So, my problem with, I think people from different disciplines talking to each other is a good thing. The problem is that if disciplines have their own histories, and if to be an active participant in a discipline requires knowledge, cumulative knowledge, it takes a long time to get that knowledge, right? And to become skilled in it. Now, some people can do that. There are people who are polymaths, who are good in many different fields. They're very rare. I think the most we can hope for is getting people to sit down and talk together and to try to understand each other. I think multidisciplinarity in one person or teaching students how to be multidisciplinary, impossible. I think in practice, right, if we can get students to learn how to read some Tang poems and a philosophical text, maybe a chapter of the Qi Wu Lun from the Zhuangzi and some Mengzi, that's not bad, that's good, but that's not having a discipline. Now, I'll tell you a story. I like telling stories, it's the way I think. A number of years ago, Stephen Owen and Pauline Yu and Willard Peters and myself organized a conference which brought together people in intellectual history and in literature. And the book that came out of that is called Ways with Words. Ways with Words. And what we decided to do was choose a series of texts that were only read by people in literature, a series of texts that were only read by people who did intellectual history and philosophy, and a series of texts that were read by both. So, Qi Wu Lun from Zhuangzi is read by both people in literature and philosophy. The Zhongyong Zhang Zhu Shu by Zhu Xi is only read by people in philosophy and intellectual history. Some of the Du Fu's poems on going to Fengshan after the death of his son or something like this, that's only read by people in literature. And so he said, this is interesting because intellectual history and literature both want to be autonomous, and we can put these people together and we can really expose the differences between our fields, our disciplines. Well, it turned out that once we all sat in the same room and started to talk about the text, disciplines disappeared. Disciplinary engagement disappeared, and people just talked about the text. And that was really interesting. It was really interesting. But we never did it again. Yes?
Thank you, Professor Paul. I want to thank you for your lectures and also your effort in your MOOC classes. And I have two questions. The first question is about the CBDB system, because I tried several times to run social network analysis in that system and all found it's 500 internal server error. So I don't know if it's very hard to do multiple layer analysis in an online platform, or if it would be easier to do it in the standalone databases.
Yes, I spent some hours a day with another Tongxue trying to go through all the problems we had with that. The online system is now being reconfigured. And so the online system will be off and on, and things won't work and will work until this transition is made. The standalone system has problems too. And so we find the bugs and we report them. And if you find a bug, go to the website and report it and say, this is, best of luck. I wish I was here longer to help. Maybe if I'm here on Friday during the day or something, I can have another workshop on this with Professor Ford.
Okay, thank you very much. And my second question would be, you talk about social movement and also the Neo-Confucianism. I wonder, because someone noticed that there are differences between Neo-Confucianism between those local communities in Hunan, Guangdong, and also Zhejiang. So I'm curious about relationship of territorial ties and Neo-Confucianism. Could you clarify more?
I think that's a really good question. My assumption is that, in fact, what we're going to see is that interpretations of texts and of traditions are, for certain periods, are highly regionalized. I think there's one clear example, I think, is the way in which some of the northern Neo-Confucians operating in Hebei, Henan, that area, in the Jin, particularly the Yuan dynasty, Mongol period in Yuan dynasty, even into the Ming, think very much in terms of court activity and state activity. While in Jiangxi and in Zhejiang, in Fujian, there's much more concern with the local community at the same time. So I do think there's regional difference, and I would expect that there are regional interpretations and regional communities.
Hello, Professor Bowles. Thank you very much for your speech today, and I had a pretty spontaneous question, which is based on several points that you mentioned today. So you said that Marxism has its origin in Christianity. However,
the Marxist theory, right?
Yeah. So to a certain extent, and another point is that Christianity had certain difficulties in finding a way into Chinese culture. So how do you see communism now, like, making its roots deeply into a land of, like, a society that once rejected Christianity? So I don't know whether this question makes sense.
No. So I don't think that China so much as rejected. In other words, I disagree with Genet, who says, well, the Chinese never could understand Christianity. I think people understand it as the way they understand it. Same with Buddhism, right? And there is some adjustment. You know, when Buddhism first comes into China, people think that Buddhism teaches that there's an eternal soul. But there's not in Buddhism, right? And eventually people figure that out. It takes a couple hundred years, but eventually they figure that out. So how Christianity develops in China, Christianity is doing pretty well in China, so we'll see how that develops. So what's the influence of Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong, Stalinism, Mao Zedong thought on the Chinese population? That's a really good question. I guess I would say that it's made it materialistic, that Marxism is materialism. And they say they're materialists, I agree, they're materialists. And so that's not necessarily a great thing, to be a materialist.
So does that mean like Confucianism actually kind of rejects materialism in some extent?
Well, if the contrast is between idealism and materialism, which is, if you think about Hou Wailu's 中国思想通史, where the fundamental analytic device is 唯心主义 and 唯物主义, materialism and idealism, then it seems to me that dichotomy is a false dichotomy, and we should get rid of it. It's a communist dichotomy, it's a Marxist dichotomy, and I think dichotomies like that are actually not very helpful. So I wouldn't want to see Confucianism as either or. I'd want to talk instead about the ways in which the Confucian tradition tries to cope with the way in which political, economic, and social and cultural power gets related to each other.
Thank you, because just reminds me of a poem, a sentence, 书中自有黄金屋，书中自有颜如玉, which is also pretty Confucian, like, which says like if you study this, you'll gain money, you'll gain beauty, and you'll gain fame, stuff like that. So it just makes me feel a little bit like ironic of the ideal that Confucianism sometimes tries to advocate.
Well, yeah. So, you know, Yuan Huang, writing in the early 17th century, has the notion that if you do good deeds, you can realize all your desires, right? And so he says, I did 10,000 good deeds, and I had a son. I did 20,000 good deeds and I passed the Ginger examination. I think it's the other way around. He passed the Ginger and then he had a son too. All the things that he wasn't supposed to have according to the fortune teller. So he changed his destiny by doing good deeds. What's interesting is he was criticized both from the Confucian side and from the Buddhist side for that point of view.
Okay, well, I guess if it's me to call an end to this, then I will say thank you once again.
Let me thank you. I did not begin today's lecture, which I should have, by thanking all my colleagues here at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, by remembering, thanking Professor Wong's our president, the head of New Asia College, and for all the hospitality that I've been shown this week. I have a number of former students and students that I've known over the years here, and people I went to school with, you, Professor Zhu, Professor Ho, and so it's been a real pleasure being here, and I thank you all very much for putting up with me for these 2 weeks. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ball and Professor Lagowing, for this inspiring lecture, and we're so sorry about the technical difficulties we encountered today. And thank you once again, Professor Ball, for the honor of visiting our college and to give 3 amazing lectures to us. And thank you very much for coming as well. And before you go, may we ask you please take some time to fill out the questionnaire that is enclosed in the booklet you took. Thank you very much, and see you all soon.
Già avevo un dolore alle caviglie, un problema di legamento. Ho detto, va bene.
Okay.